The Algarve is Portugal's southernmost coast, a long sweep of limestone cliff and sandy beach along the Atlantic, where the light has a particular quality in May, golden and warm, but not yet the bleached white of midsummer, where the sea is still cold enough to make swimming an adventure rather than a routine, where the air carries the smell of salt and pine and the specific warmth of the Mediterranean climate settling into its long summer rhythm. In May of 2007, it was one of the most popular holiday destinations in Europe, drawing British and German and Dutch families by the hundreds of thousands to the small resort towns strung along the coast, Albufeira and Portimao, Tavira and Lagos, and the quiet village of Praia da Luz on the western edge of the Algarve, where the cliffs are high and the beach is a crescent of pale sand, and the town is small enough that you can walk its entire length in 20 minutes. The Ocean Club Resort sits in the middle of Praia da Luz, a collection of apartment blocks and villas arranged around a central reception area, with a pool and a tennis court and a tapas restaurant that serves the guests in the evenings. It is a family resort, deliberately and consistently, the kind of place that British families return to year after year because it is reliable and safe and child-friendly, because the staff know how to accommodate young children, because the evenings are warm enough to sit outside and the distances between the apartment blocks and the restaurants are short enough that the question of what to do with very young children while their parents have dinner in the evening is answered by the short distance itself, the proximity, the feeling of a contained and knowable space where children are safe. Kate and Jerry McCann had been to the Algarve before. They were a couple in their late 30s, both doctors, settled in Leicestershire in the English Midlands, with a life that was full and ordered and defined by the particular combination of professional commitment and family love that characterizes people who have built something deliberately and with care. They had married in 1998. Their daughter Madeleine had been born on May 12, 2003, their first child, conceived with the help of IVF after difficulties that had required patience and resilience, and the specific hope of people who want something very much and are prepared to wait for it. She had arrived, Madeleine, with what Kate McCann has described as an extraordinary quality, a presence, a brightness that was visible from the beginning, a personality that was developing by 3 years old into something recognizable and specific and entirely her own. She was small for her age, with blonde hair that lightened further in the sun, and blue eyes, one of which had a small, distinctive mark, a dark strand of pigmentation that crossed from the iris into the pupil of her right eye, called a coloboma, a feature that her parents sometimes called her blemish, and that would become one of the most reproduced images in the history of missing children cases, the close-up of that blue eye, with its distinctive dark fleck, used on posters and on websites and in newspaper articles across more than a decade. She liked Fireman Sam and Angelina Ballerina. She had, as 3-year-olds do, a strong will and a clear sense of her own preferences, and a way of expressing both that her parents found both exhausting and delightful, the specific combination of challenge and joy that is the reality of being the parent of a child who is fully themselves. Madeleine had siblings, Sean and Amélie, twins, born in February of 2005, were 2 years old in May of 2007, and the 3 children together formed the specific universe that the McCann family revolved around. The holiday to the Algarve was with a group of 9 adults, all friends, forming what the subsequent investigation would come to call the Tapas 7, 7 other adults who were sharing the holiday with Kate and Jerry and their children, staying in adjacent apartments and villas within the Ocean Club complex. They had been there since the previous Saturday, had settled into the rhythms of a family holiday, the mornings at the beach, the afternoon naps, the evenings at the tapas restaurant that was a short walk from the apartment block where they were staying. Apartment 5A was on the ground floor of Block 5 of the Ocean Club, a compact holiday apartment with bedrooms accessed from a central living area, with a veranda at the rear and a door at the side that opened onto a path between the apartment blocks. The layout of the apartment would be described and analyzed and debated in the years that followed, with an exhaustiveness that reflects both the importance of every physical detail in the investigation and the specific quality of a case in which every inch of ground has been covered and recovered in the search for what happened on the night of May 3, 2007. That evening, the McCanns and their friends dined at the tapas restaurant, which was within the resort complex, separated from Block 5 by a relatively short distance. The exact layout of the resort and the sight lines between the restaurant and the apartment have been the subject of extensive analysis. How clearly the apartment could be seen from the restaurant, what an observer at the table could and could not observe about the approach to the apartment, what the walk between the restaurant and the apartment involved in terms of time and distance. The group had established a routine across the preceding evenings, the adults checking on the children at intervals during the dinner, the children sleeping in the apartments while the parents ate nearby. The checking was done by the adults themselves, not by the resort's babysitting service, which the group had used on some earlier evenings but had not arranged for May 3rd. Kate McCann checked on the children at approximately 10 o'clock that evening. She walked from the restaurant to the apartment, entered, and found the bedroom door open at an angle different from how she had left it. The curtains were moving in a breeze. She found the twins still sleeping in their cots. She found the bed in which Madeleine had been sleeping empty. Madeleine was not in the apartment. Kate McCann searched the apartment, each room, the cupboards, the veranda, the bathroom, understanding in those seconds, with the escalating clarity of a parent who has found an impossible thing, that her daughter was not there, that the apartment was empty of the child who should have been in it, and she ran back to the restaurant and told Jerry. She is reported to have said the words that would be repeated in news reports across the world. Madeleine's gone. What followed were the immediate, chaotic, desperate hours of a family and a group of friends confronting the worst possible understanding of a worst possible moment. Gary McCann ran back to the apartment. Other members of the group began searching the surrounding area. Resort staff were alerted. The Portuguese police, the GNR, were called. Other guests began to wake and to help. The search expanded into the streets around the Ocean Club, to the beach, to the surrounding area of Praia da Luz, with the specific urgency of the first hours of a child's disappearance, when everyone still believes that the child will be found within minutes, that she has walked out of the apartment in the night, that she is close, that this will resolve. It did not resolve. The hours passed. Madeleine was not found. The Portuguese judicial police, the Policia Judiciaria, were notified, and detectives arrived from Lagos, the nearest major city. A search of the local area produced no trace of the child. The night passed into morning, and the investigation that would eventually consume nearly 2 decades of law enforcement resources in multiple countries was in its first, fractured, terrifying hours. The days that followed are part of the public record in a way that no other missing child case in British history has been, and that specificity of the public record is itself one of the defining characteristics of the Madeleine McCann case, which was, within days of her disappearance, one of the most reported stories in the world. The media arrived in Praia da Luz in enormous numbers, satellite trucks and photographers and reporters from every major news organization on the planet, drawn by the combination of factors that make a news story irresistible. The beauty of the setting, the ordinariness of the circumstances, the photogenic quality of the missing child, the articulacy and the evident grief of the parents, and the simple, terrible fact that a healthy child from a stable, loving family had vanished in the night, from a safe resort, in a popular holiday destination, in a way that no one could explain. Kate and Jerry McCann made the choice, very early in the investigation, to engage actively with the media rather than to withdraw from it. A choice that was both a genuine strategic decision about how to keep Madeleine's face and name in public circulation, and a specific expression of who they were as people, capable and purposeful even in extremity, unwilling to simply wait while others managed the situation. Gary McCann kept a blog from the early days. Kate McCann gave interviews. They appeared at press conferences. Parents who were obviously devastated and obviously determined, their public composure masking a private anguish that Kate McCann would eventually describe in full and shattering detail in the book she wrote about the experience. The campaign to find Madeleine became, in those early weeks and months, one of the most sustained and organized missing child campaigns in history, with a formal fund, a website, a helpline, ambassadors and celebrity supporters, and the direct engagement of heads of government. Pope Benedict XVI granted Kate and Jerry McCann a private audience when they visited Rome. Gordon Brown, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, spoke about the case in the House of Commons. Ambassadors were lobbied. Rewards were offered. The Find Madeleine campaign generated a level of public engagement that reflected both the specific qualities of the case and the specific qualities of Kate and Jerry McCann as advocates for their missing daughter, their refusal to accept the possibility of silence, their determination to keep the question of what had happened to Madeleine in the public consciousness for as long as it took to find an answer. While all of this was happening, the investigation was proceeding in ways that were, from the beginning, complicated by factors that would shape the entire subsequent history of the case. The Portuguese Policia Judiciaria, the criminal investigation arm of the Portuguese police, was led in Praia da Luz by Gonzalo Amaral, an experienced detective from the Algarve region who had worked major crimes for years and who would become, in the years after the investigation, a deeply controversial figure in the case's history. The investigation in those early days and weeks focused on the physical evidence of the apartment and the surrounding area, the witness accounts from people who had been at the resort or in the village on the night of the 3rd, and the specific, difficult question of what had actually happened in the time between the last confirmed sighting of Madeleine and Kate McCann's discovery of her absence. The last confirmed sighting of Madeleine alive was at approximately 9 p.m. on the evening of May 3rd, when Jerry McCann checked on the children during the dinner and found them sleeping. He saw Madeleine. She was there, in her bed, sleeping, and everything was as it should be. The window between that confirmed sighting at approximately 9 p.m. and Kate McCann's discovery of her absence at approximately 10 p.m. is the window within which everything happened, within which whatever occurred in apartment 5A occurred, and it is a window that the investigation has spent nearly 20 years trying to see through clearly. In those 60 minutes, the apartment was checked by other members of the group. Matthew Oldfield, one of the friends, entered the apartment sometime around 9:30 p.m. and looked in on the children from the doorway. He later told police he did not see Madeleine clearly, that he could see the twins, but that his check had been brief. This account, and its implications for exactly when in the 60-minute window Madeleine had already gone, has been the subject of extensive analysis and some controversy about the reliability of memory in conditions of shock and stress. Jane Tanner, another member of the group, reported seeing a man carrying a child as she walked toward the apartment on one of the checking trips. She described the child as dressed in pink pajamas, being carried across the road by a man who walked purposefully and without looking at her. This sighting became one of the earliest and most significant leads in the investigation, the possibility that someone had been seen carrying a child from the resort in those early evening hours. A photo feed of the man Jane Tanner described was developed and released. For years, it was the primary visual representation of a possible suspect in the case. The Tanner sighting was complicated, however. Its exact timing in relation to Jerry McCann's 9 p.m. check was uncertain, and the possibility that it could have predated that check, which would have changed its significance dramatically, was explored without resolution. In later years, following the British reinvestigation that began in 2011, the Tanner sighting would be officially re-evaluated, with British police concluding that the man she had seen was likely another holidaymaker at the resort who was carrying his own child to bed at the time. If that re-evaluation is correct, the Tanner sighting, which had been a central element of the early investigation, was a significant lead that led nowhere. The second major sighting that has remained of interest across the entire investigation is what became known as the Smithman sighting. On the same evening, a few minutes before 10 p.m., an Irish family, Martin Smith and his wife, and their adult and teenage children, were walking back through the streets of Praia da Luz toward where they were staying when they passed a man carrying a young child. Martin Smith later described the man as walking purposefully, carrying a sleeping child with bare feet, not interacting with the family as they passed. The child appeared to be between 3 and 4 years old, with blonde hair. The family did not think anything of it at the time, were not aware of the events at the Ocean Club, and it was only later, when news of Madeleine's disappearance became public, that they connected what they had seen to the case and reported it to police. In 2008, Martin Smith watched a news broadcast that showed Jerry McCann stepping off a plane while carrying his daughter, and he told his family that the way Jerry McCann carried the child reminded him of the way the man he had seen in Praia da Luz had carried the child he was holding. He made clear that he was not saying the man was Jerry McCann, that it was only the carrying posture that had produced the association, and that he had no clear identification of the man he had seen. The Smithman sighting, with its relatively clear timing close to 10 p.m. and its description of a child matching Madeleine's general appearance, has remained one of the most significant unresolved elements of the case. The Portuguese investigation, in its early months, was operating under conditions that the investigators themselves would later characterize as challenging. The resort had been heavily used and potentially compromised as a crime scene in the hours immediately after Madeleine's disappearance, with large numbers of people having been through the apartment and the surrounding area before formal forensic examination began. The physical evidence recovered from the apartment and from the area around it was limited and, in crucial respects, ambiguous. No direct forensic evidence clearly indicating how Madeleine had left the apartment was found in those early searches. In the summer of 2007, the investigation took a turn that would have profound consequences for the years that followed. British police dogs, trained in the detection of human cadaver odor and human blood, were brought to Praia da Luz to assist the investigation. The dogs, named Eddie and Keela, were worked through the apartment and through several other locations associated with the case, including a hire car that the McCanns had rented approximately 25 days after Madeleine's disappearance. The dogs produced a number of alerts, including in the apartment, on items belonging to Kate McCann and in the hire car. The alerts were logged and forensic samples were taken for analysis. The results of the laboratory analysis of those samples were, in the event, inconclusive. Some samples returned no result. Some returned findings that were potentially consistent with the presence of DNA from Madeleine, but that fell below the threshold for definitive identification. The interpretation of the dog's behavior and the laboratory results became one of the most controversial elements of the entire case. The dog's handlers were confident in the reliability of their animals' alerts. Scientists who analyzed the laboratory results were cautious about what those results actually established. Gonzalo Amaral's investigation became increasingly focused on a theory that Madeleine had died in the apartment, possibly as a result of an accident, and that her parents had been involved in concealing her death. In September of 2007, Kate and Gerry McCann were given arguido status by the Portuguese police, a formal designation under Portuguese law that indicates a person is being treated as a suspect and is entitled to certain procedural rights. They denied any involvement in their daughter's disappearance. They returned to the United Kingdom and continued their campaign to find Madeleine from there. The arguido status was lifted in July of 2008, when the Policia Judiciaria archived the case, concluding that there was insufficient evidence to sustain any charges against the McCanns or against any other identified individual. Gonzalo Amaral had left the investigation the previous October under circumstances that reflected the pressure the case had generated, and he had subsequently written a book, published in Portugal, in which he set out his theory that Madeleine had died accidentally in the apartment and that her parents had been involved in concealing her death. Kate and Gerry McCann pursued legal action against Amaral and his book across a decade of proceedings in the Portuguese courts, a prolonged and painful legal battle that eventually concluded with a ruling in favor of Amaral, allowing the book to remain in circulation. The legal proceedings required the McCanns to engage repeatedly in formal legal settings with a theory about their daughter's fate that they have consistently and absolutely denied. The archiving of the case in 2008 did not mean the end of the search for Madeleine. Kate and Gerry McCann continued to fund a private investigation using money raised by the Find Madeleine campaign. They hired investigators, processed tips, followed leads across multiple countries. The scale of the public interest in the case meant that tip-offs and reported sightings arrived from around the world, each one requiring assessment, each one representing the hope and the burden of a family that could not stop looking, because stopping meant accepting something they were not prepared to accept. In 2011, the British Home Secretary ordered a formal review of the case by the Metropolitan Police, which became known as Operation Grange. The review, which began under Commissioner Bernard Hogan-Howe, started as an examination of the existing evidence and investigation and expanded into a full criminal investigation, with British detectives working in Portugal alongside their Portuguese counterparts, examining individuals who had not previously been formally investigated and exploring leads that had not been fully followed in the original investigation. Operation Grange has consumed, across more than a decade of work, tens of millions of pounds of British public money, and has been the subject of periodic political debate about the resources being allocated to a single case. The operation worked its way through a significant number of persons of interest, clearing many of them through the investigative process. It examined the evidence of the early investigation with fresh eyes and the resources of a major metropolitan police force, and it reached its own conclusions about some of the established elements of the case, including the re-evaluation of the Tanner sighting noted above. It also worked to develop new leads and to identify individuals who had been in the Praia da Luz area in May of 2007 and who had not previously come to the attention of the investigation. And then, in June of 2020, the German Federal Police and German prosecutors made a public announcement that changed the public understanding of the case in a fundamental way. They named a suspect. They stated that they believed Madeleine McCann was dead. They stated that they were treating a 43-year-old German man as the prime suspect in her murder. The man's name was Christian Brueckner, and his emergence as the publicly identified prime suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was the most significant development in the case since the 2008 archiving. Christian Brueckner was born in 1976 in Germany. His life prior to his emergence as a suspect in the McCann case was a record of serious criminal behavior spanning decades, including drug offenses, theft, and multiple incidents of sexual violence. He had lived in the Algarve for extended periods, in the years prior to Madeleine's disappearance, was known to local residents and to the local criminal justice system for a range of offenses, and was a person whose lifestyle and criminal background placed him in a very different category from the tourists and holidaymakers who populated the resort towns of the Algarve each summer. He had no fixed residence, living at various points in a camper van, in abandoned properties, and in makeshift accommodations in the Portuguese countryside. One particular fact about his background in the Algarve was of central significance when his name emerged publicly in 2020. In September of 2005, a 72-year-old American tourist was raped in Praia da Luz. The attack occurred in a holiday villa. Christian Brueckner was subsequently convicted of this offense by a German court, a conviction that established as a matter of proven legal fact that he had committed a serious sexual assault in the very village from which Madeleine McCann disappeared less than 2 years later. The evidence linking Brueckner to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, as described by German prosecutors in their 2020 announcement and in subsequent statements, included mobile phone data. Records indicated that a phone connected to Brueckner had made a call from very close to the Ocean Club resort complex on the evening of May 3, 2007, in the window of time during which Madeleine went missing. He also owned a vehicle that was consistent in type with vehicles reported in the area that evening. Witnesses have reportedly described hearing him make boasting remarks about the case, remarks that suggested a knowledge of what had happened, that went beyond what a member of the public could have known from media coverage alone. German prosecutors, in their 2020 statement, indicated that they were treating the case as one in which they believed Madeleine was dead and that Brueckner was responsible for her death. They appealed publicly for witnesses, people who had known Brueckner or spent time with him in Portugal in 2007, to come forward with any information they might have. The announcement prompted a wave of public response and a renewed intensity of media attention on the case, bringing it to the attention of a generation that had been too young to be aware of it in 2007, and producing, for the families and friends of people who had known Brueckner in those years, a renewed urgency about any memories they might have of relevant conversations or events. The German prosecutor's announcement was made in the context of ongoing legal proceedings against Brueckner that were separate from the McCann investigation. He had been in German prison, serving a sentence for drug trafficking, when the McCann connection was publicly disclosed. The German legal system then mounted a prosecution against him on a range of serious sexual offenses relating to other victims in Portugal, offenses that, if proven, would have established a pattern of serious sexual violence in the Algarve area that prosecutors believed was relevant context for understanding what had happened to Madeleine. The trial on those charges proceeded through the German court system across subsequent years. In October of 2024, following prolonged and complex proceedings, Christian Brueckner was acquitted of those charges. The acquittal was a significant setback for the prosecution's case, though it was important to note that an acquittal on those specific charges did not address or resolve the separate investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance, which remained under active investigation. German prosecutors indicated following the acquittal that their investigation into the McCann case remained ongoing. Brueckner's prison sentence in Germany came to an end in September of 2025, and his release from custody was preceded by a period of uncertainty and intense activity by the investigating authorities. British Metropolitan Police detectives, operating under Operation Grange, sought a final interview with Brueckner before his release, an interview that German authorities declined to facilitate in the form the British investigators requested. Brueckner was released from custody following the completion of his sentence. He was placed under electronic monitoring, required to remain in Germany and to report regularly, and his passport was withheld, preventing international travel. The situation as it stands in the summer of 2026, as investigators continue their work, is one defined by both what has been established and what remains unknown. British and German investigators continue to work the case cooperatively. Scotland Yard has been pursuing the possibility of extradition proceedings that would bring Brueckner to the United Kingdom to face questioning or charges under British jurisdiction. German prosecutors have compiled an evidence dossier that has been described as substantial and which British detectives have received and are working through, seeking within it the specific pieces of evidence that would support formal charges. Brueckner, under the terms of his electronic monitoring and without a valid passport, remains in Germany, subject to oversight but not in custody. He has not been charged in connection with Madeleine McCann's disappearance. He has not been tried. He has not been convicted of anything related to the case. He maintains, through his legal representatives, his denial of any involvement. These facts must be stated clearly, because the legal status of the investigation requires them to be stated clearly. Christian Brueckner is, in legal terms, a suspect whom German prosecutors have publicly identified and stated they believe to be responsible, but he is not a convicted man, and the legal process that would establish guilt or innocence has not yet run its course. What is established as a matter of proven fact is this: Madeleine McCann, aged 3 years and 3 weeks, disappeared from an apartment in a Portuguese holiday resort on the night of May 3, 2007. She has never been found. No one has been charged with any offense directly related to her disappearance. The investigation has been ongoing for nearly 20 years, across multiple countries and under multiple jurisdictions. A prime suspect has been publicly identified by German prosecutors, who have stated their belief that Madeleine is dead, but that suspect has not been charged or tried in relation to her disappearance. The McCanns have lived with this situation for nearly 2 decades. Kate McCann's book, Madeleine, published in 2011, remains one of the most clear and devastating accounts of what it means to lose a child in these specific circumstances, to be both grieving parent and investigation subject, to be conducting a public campaign while living a private reality of grief and uncertainty that cannot be fully communicated to the outside world. Gary McCann has continued to make public statements at significant points in the case's history, maintaining the family's position that they believe the investigation can and should produce answers, expressing cautious but real hope at moments when the investigation has appeared to be making progress. Managing the expectations of a public that follows the case closely and that sometimes requires reminding that investigations of this complexity take time and that the people at the center of the case are real human beings, not characters in a story. The twins, Sean and Amelie, were 2 years old when their sister disappeared. They are now in their early 20s, young adults whose entire lives have been lived in the shadow of their sister's disappearance, who have grown up knowing the public face of a family grief that is also simply their family, their reality, the thing they were born into, and that has shaped everything about how they have experienced their own lives. They have, by Kate and Jerry McCann's accounts, been shielded as much as possible from the full weight of the media attention, raised in as normal and as loving an environment as their parents could provide, and have grown into people who understand the significance of what happened to their family and who carry it with the specific resilience of people who have never known anything else. They have their sister's photograph in their rooms. They have grown up with the specific, inarticulable absence of a sibling they barely knew and whom the world has never stopped asking about. Madeleine McCann would be 22 years old as of May 2026. She would be at university, or working, or traveling, or doing whatever the specific combination of her personality and her circumstances had led her to do with the 19 years she has not had. The specific content of those 19 years, the experiences and the relationships and the choices that would have made up the life of a young woman who was last seen as a small child in a holiday apartment, is unknowable in a way that makes the grief of the case impossible to fully articulate. The child in the photographs is 3 years old. The person she would have become is a question mark. She would have grown up. She would have changed. She would have had opinions and passions, and the specific combination of her parents' traits and her own emerging character that produces, in every child, something unique and irreplaceable. The case has had effects on the landscape of British and European policy around missing children and around child safety in holiday settings. The Madeleine McCann disappearance contributed to changes in how British parents think about the supervision of children during holidays, prompted discussions about the responsibilities of resorts toward the children of their guests, and produced a heightened public awareness of the risks that, while modest in any individual family's holiday experience, are not zero. It became a touchstone for discussions about media coverage of missing children cases, about the ethics of the coverage intensity that descended on Praia da Luz in those early weeks, about the specific dynamics of a case in which the parents of the missing child became, simultaneously, the most recognizable advocates for finding her and the subjects of public speculation and sometimes cruel online discussion about their culpability. That online discussion, which has produced some of the most extreme examples of armchair investigation and unfounded accusation in the internet era, has been one of the most distressing elements of the case's public life for the McCann family and for the people close to them. Kate and Gerry McCann have, on various occasions, had to take legal action against people who published specific, false allegations about them. They have had to manage the specific reality of being the parents of a missing child in an age of social media where every new development in the case produces a fresh wave of comment and speculation, where the people who believe Brueckner is responsible for Madeleine's disappearance and the people who believe the McCanns no more than they have said coexist in a digital environment that does not distinguish between the evidence-based and the groundless. The McCanns have maintained their dignity throughout this, have continued to engage with legitimate investigative journalism while declining to platform conspiracy theories, have kept the focus, to the degree they can, on the simple and paramount question of what happened to their daughter. The investigation continues. The German dossier is in the hands of British investigators. The extradition question is before the relevant legal authorities. Christian Brueckner remains under electronic monitoring in Germany, unable to leave the country, obligated to report to the authorities at regular intervals. German prosecutors maintain their stated belief in his responsibility. Operation Grange maintains its active investigation. The specific legal pathway by which the case reaches a courtroom, if it does, remains uncertain, dependent on the evidence assembled, the cooperation between jurisdictions, and the specific decisions of legal authorities in Germany and the United Kingdom about what can be charged and what can be proven to the standard that criminal prosecution requires. The 20th anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance will occur in May 2027. It will be marked, as every anniversary has been marked, with media coverage, with statements from the McCanns, with expressions of public solidarity and private grief, with the specific rituals of remembrance that have accumulated around the case across 2 decades. The anniversary will also, inevitably, prompt an assessment of where the investigation stands, what has been accomplished and what remains to be accomplished, what the current state of the legal process suggests about whether answers will come before another anniversary has passed. Praia da Luz continues to exist as a small beach resort town on the western Algarve, its cliffs and its beach unchanged by the events of May 2007, its summer seasons still bringing thousands of holidaying families to the same streets and the same restaurants and the same view of the Atlantic. The town is what it was, quiet in winter, busy in summer, carrying, like all places that have been the setting for events of great consequence, the specific dual existence of being both itself and the place where something happened, both a resort village and the location of one of the most discussed, unsolved disappearances in modern history. Apartment 5A exists. The bedroom where Madeleine slept is a physical space that endures. The path between the apartment and the tapas restaurant is walkable in the same way it was walkable on the evening of May 3, 2007. The physical geography of that evening, the distances and the sightlines and the layout of the resort is unchanged. Only Madeleine is changed, in the most absolute of all possible ways. She is gone, and where she is, and what happened to her, remains the central unanswered question of a case that has not run out of investigators, or out of evidence, or out of the determination of the people who loved her, and who have spent nearly 2 decades demanding on her behalf the answers that she deserves. The question of what happened in apartment 5A on the night of May 3, 2007, between the time Jerry McCann checked on the children and saw his daughter sleeping safely, and the time Kate McCann returned to find the apartment empty, is the question that the investigation has not yet answered to the standard of legal certainty. The German prosecutors believe they know. British investigators are working toward the moment when the evidence assembled is sufficient to support formal charges. Christian Brueckner, the man who has been publicly named as the prime suspect, remains beyond the reach of a criminal trial while the legal process continues. Madeleine McCann was 3 years old. She was a child on a family holiday, sleeping in an apartment in Portugal, and she was loved, and she was wanted, and she has never come home. That is the beginning and the end of the case. Everything else, the investigation and the suspects and the legal proceedings and the media attention and the 2 decades of searching, is the world's attempt to account for the ending of a child's life in circumstances that have not yet been fully explained, an attempt that is still ongoing, that has not given up, and that in the summer of 2026, with a dossier of German evidence in British hands and a prime suspect under electronic monitoring and extradition proceedings in progress, is closer than it has ever been to the moment of reckoning that 3-year-old Madeleine McCann, her family, and a generation of people who followed her case deserve. She would be 22 years old. The world is still looking for the answer to what happened to her. The world has not stopped. The investigation's texture across these nearly 20 years has been shaped by the specific conditions of each phase, by the political and institutional contexts within which different phases of the investigation were conducted, by the specific capabilities and limitations of the law enforcement agencies involved, and by the wider cultural and technological changes that altered what was possible to investigate and what was possible to prove across the period. The 2007 investigation was conducted in an environment of social media that was in its earliest infancy, where mobile phone data existed and was used, but where the volume and variety of digital evidence that is now routine in major criminal investigations was not yet available. The 2011 Operation Grange review was conducted in an environment where digital forensics had advanced significantly and where the reanalysis of existing evidence using improved techniques was possible. The current phase of the investigation benefits from further advances in data analysis, mobile phone forensics, and the international cooperation frameworks that have developed across the intervening decades. The specific use of mobile phone data in the investigation of the case has been one of the most significant technical elements. Mobile phone records from the night of May 3, 2007, in the area of Praia da Luz, have been analyzed and reanalyzed over the years, and it is within this body of data that the evidence linking Christian Brueckner to the vicinity of the Ocean Club on that evening has been found. The specific nature of that evidence, as described by German investigators and prosecutors, without being fully disclosed in the public domain, relates to calls made by a phone associated with Brueckner from a location very close to the resort on the night in question. The interpretation of this data, its significance as evidence of his presence, and its relationship to the timeline of Madeleine's disappearance, has been the subject of extensive analysis by investigators in both Germany and the United Kingdom. Mobile phone data is not, by itself, proof of a crime. The presence of a person in the vicinity of a crime does not establish their commission of that crime. The investigators pursuing the case understand this, and the evidentiary structure that German prosecutors have described as supporting their belief in Brueckner's responsibility for Madeleine's death must, to support criminal charges and a conviction, amount to more than the placement of a phone near the Ocean Club. What else forms part of that evidentiary structure has not been fully disclosed, for the same reasons that investigators in active cases do not disclose the full scope of their evidence before the appropriate moment, to protect the integrity of the investigation and to preserve the ability to present evidence effectively at trial. The witness accounts of Brueckner making remarks suggestive of knowledge about the case have been reported in various media investigations and have been described by German prosecutors as part of the evidence they are working with. These accounts, if verified and admitted, would be significant because they would potentially establish that Brueckner possessed knowledge about what happened to Madeleine that could not have been derived from public sources. The specific content of the remarks allegedly made, and the specific witnesses who have reported them, form part of the evidence that investigators have gathered and that would be tested in any future criminal proceedings. The trial that German prosecutors pursued against Brueckner on the separate charges of sexual assault ended in his acquittal in October 2024. The acquittal was reached after a prolonged trial in which the defense challenged the reliability of witness testimony and the procedural integrity of aspects of the prosecution's case. The acquittal does not, and legally cannot, mean that Christian Brueckner is cleared of responsibility for Madeleine McCann's disappearance, which is a separate matter being investigated under different procedures and in different jurisdictions. But it did represent a significant moment in the case's legal history, one that both the German and British investigators had to process and incorporate into their ongoing strategy for bringing the investigation to a conclusion that could support criminal proceedings. The decision of the German authorities not to facilitate a final interview by British Metropolitan Police investigators before Brueckner's release from prison in September 2025 reflected the specific complexities of the cross-jurisdictional nature of the case, the competing interests of different legal systems, and the specific procedural considerations of two national law enforcement agencies cooperating on an investigation where the formal legal jurisdiction over any potential prosecution remained contested. Germany and the United Kingdom have different legal traditions, different standards of evidence, and different procedures for managing the investigation and prosecution of serious crimes, and the management of the Madeleine McCann case across those different systems has required sustained and sometimes difficult diplomatic and legal negotiation. The question of jurisdiction has been one of the case's persistent structural complexities. The crime, if a crime was committed, and by whom it was committed, is not yet legally established, occurred on Portuguese territory. The prime suspect is a German national. The victim's family are British citizens. The primary investigating agencies are the German Federal Police, the German state prosecutors, and the British Metropolitan Police, working in cooperation with the Portuguese Policia Judiciaria. The question of where any trial would be held, if and when charges are brought, involves legal and diplomatic considerations that reflect the specific provisions of international criminal law and the bilateral agreements between the countries involved. Portugal, as the country where the alleged crime occurred, has certain rights under international law. Germany, as the country of the suspect's nationality and current residence, has its own legal obligations and rights. The United Kingdom, as the country whose investigators have been most publicly prominent in the recent phase of the investigation, is pursuing the possibility of proceedings on British soil. The extradition question being pursued by Scotland Yard involves seeking the transfer of Christian Brueckner to the United Kingdom to face questioning or charges under British jurisdiction. Extradition procedures between EU member states and the United Kingdom following the UK's departure from the European Union are governed by specific treaty arrangements that were negotiated as part of the post-Brexit framework, and those arrangements are the legal instruments through which any extradition would be processed. The proceedings are active, which is to say that they are being pursued rather than simply being contemplated, but they are also complex, and the specific timeline of those proceedings is not something that investigators or legal authorities have been able to predict with confidence. The German evidence dossier that British detectives received in the period leading up to the summer of 2026 has been described in reporting on the case as substantial, as representing a significant body of evidence accumulated by German investigators across the years since Brueckner was publicly named as a suspect. The analysis of that dossier by British investigators and the assessment of what within it is relevant to any British proceedings and what standard it meets for the purposes of supporting charges is work that takes time and that requires the engagement of specialists in German law in the specific categories of evidence contained in the dossier and in the procedural requirements of British criminal courts. The fact that this work is being done and is being done with the apparent commitment of significant resources is itself a meaningful statement about the current state of the investigation's momentum. Operation Grange, the British Metropolitan Police investigation that began in 2011, has been a subject of public comment and sometimes criticism across its more than a decade of operation. It has cost very substantial sums of public money. It has been the subject of periodic questions in the British Parliament about its cost-effectiveness and about the prospects of its reaching a conclusion. The police and the Home Office have consistently maintained that the investigation is active and is making progress, and that the resources committed to it are appropriate given the nature of the case and the evidence that investigators believe exists. The political dimension of the case, the fact that it involves a British family, and that the British government has committed the resources of the Metropolitan Police to the investigation, has ensured that it remains subject to a level of public and parliamentary scrutiny that most criminal investigations do not face. The private investigation that Kate and Gerry McCann funded through the Find Madeleine campaign across the years between the 2008 archiving of the Portuguese case and the launch of Operation Grange in 2011 produced its own work and its own leads, some of which were shared with official investigators and some of which formed part of the foundation on which the official investigation subsequently built. The private investigators who worked on the case during this period had a different mandate and different constraints from official law enforcement, and their work, while necessarily limited in comparison to what a full national police investigation could do, kept the case active during a period when official investigative resource had been withdrawn. Kate McCann has written about the experience of funding and directing a private investigation while simultaneously managing the public campaign and living a family life that included raising the twins through their childhood, the extraordinary weight of all of that running simultaneously across the years. The global coverage of the case produced, across the 2 decades since 2007, a vast body of journalism, documentary filmmaking, and online discussion, some of it of high quality and genuine investigative value, and some of it of deeply questionable quality, including material that made unfounded allegations against specific individuals and material that promoted theories unsupported by evidence. The production and distribution of this material created specific problems for the investigation and for the people involved in it. The publication of material that contaminated witnesses, the publication of theories that focused public attention on individuals who had no genuine connection to the case, and the specific harm caused to Kate and Gerry McCann by the publication of material asserting their involvement in their daughter's disappearance. The McCanns' legal actions against some of those who published the most harmful, unfounded allegations, including the prolonged litigation against Gonçalo Amaral in Portugal, were necessary responses to material that caused them genuine and documented harm, but that were also enormously costly in time, money, and emotional resources that would otherwise have been available for the search for their daughter. The legal proceedings in Portugal over Amaral's book ran for more than a decade through multiple courts and multiple appeals, and the eventual outcome, which allowed the book to remain in publication, was described by Kate McCann as a disappointment. The proceedings themselves, however, were a demonstration of the McCanns' sustained refusal to accept that unfounded allegations about their role in Madeleine's disappearance would go unchallenged. The responsibility that comes with covering a case of this sensitivity and this significance, the responsibility to report what is known accurately and to be clear about what is theory or suspicion rather than established fact, has not always been honored by the full spectrum of media that has engaged with the case. The consequence of that failure of responsibility has been real harm to real people, including to the McCanns themselves and to other individuals who have been the subject of unfounded accusations. It has also produced, in some quarters, a kind of investigative fatigue or skepticism about any claim relating to the case, a response to the years of overclaiming that can sometimes make it difficult for genuinely significant developments to receive the attention they deserve. The 2020 German announcement was, in this context, one of the most carefully credentialed and most clearly significant public developments in the case's history. It was made by law enforcement agencies with formal legal standing and with clear accountability for what they were saying. It was carefully worded to distinguish between what they believed, which they stated with confidence, and what they could prove to the legal standard required for charges, which they acknowledged required further work. It was not a rushed or reckless claim, but a measured statement from investigators who had been working the case for years and who had reached a level of confidence in their conclusion that they were prepared to state it publicly. The response to the 2020 announcement from Kate and Gerry McCann was characteristic of how they have managed the public dimension of the case across 2 decades. Measured, careful, neither overclaiming what the announcement meant, nor understating its significance. They acknowledged that it was a significant development. They noted that the investigation was ongoing and that answers were not yet established. They maintained the position they have maintained throughout, that they believe their daughter was taken by a stranger, that they are committed to the investigation, producing the answers it should produce, and that they continue to hope, in whatever terms hope can be applied to a situation that has already involved 19 years of not knowing. What hope means in this context, what it actually consists of for parents who have spent nearly 20 years in the specific state of not knowing what happened to their child, is something that Kate McCann has addressed with extraordinary honesty and clarity in her writing and her interviews. It is not the simple, forward-looking hope of normal life. It is something more complex and more specific, a hope directed at the possibility of an answer rather than at the possibility of a particular outcome, because the range of possible outcomes has narrowed in ways that the German prosecutor's 2020 statement made explicit. It is a hope for truth, for the specific and terrible knowledge that would allow Kate and Gerry McCann to know, definitively, what happened to their daughter, and for the legal process to hold whoever is responsible accountable for what they did. That hope is what the current phase of the investigation represents. The German evidence dossier in British hands, the extradition proceedings being pursued, the electronic monitoring of a suspect who has been publicly named as responsible by the investigating authority of one country, and who is being pursued by the investigative authority of another. The 20th anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance is less than a year away from the summer of 2026, and the specific combination of factors currently in play represents, in the assessment of those who follow the case most carefully, the most advanced state of the investigation since it began. Whether that advanced state produces charges, a trial, and a verdict before another anniversary passes is a question that no one in the investigation is in a position to answer with certainty. Criminal investigations of this complexity and this cross-jurisdictional character do not move on neat timelines. The evidence must be sufficient. The legal pathway must be clear. The procedural requirements of the relevant courts must be met. All of these things take the time they take, and the history of the McCann case teaches, above all else, that it takes the time it takes. Madeleine McCann was born on May 12, 2003, in Leicester, England, the first child of Kate and Gerry McCann. She was 3 years old when she was last seen. She would be 22 years old in May of 2026. The world has not found her, and has not found a complete account of what happened to her, but the world, in the form of the investigators and the prosecutors and the legal systems of 3 countries working in cooperation, has not stopped trying. She deserved to grow up. She deserved the 22 years she has not had. She deserved the person she would have become, the decisions and the experiences and the relationships and the ordinary accumulations of a life lived. The world owes her an answer, and the investigation that is closest in its history to providing that answer is still working, in the summer of 2026, in the specific way of institutions that understand that what they are doing matters, and that what they are doing is not finished. The answer is still out there. The case is still open. Madeleine McCann is still waiting for the truth of what happened to her to be told. The landscape of the Algarve in May has a particular quality that anyone who has visited the region will recognize, a quality that makes the events of May 3, 2007 feel both possible and impossible simultaneously. The possible, because the Algarve in May is full of families, full of children, full of the ordinary relaxation of people on holiday who have reduced their vigilance along with their stress levels, who are in a mode of being that is different from their ordinary domestic vigilance because the conditions around them feel safe. The impossible because the Algarve in May is exactly that, a family holiday destination, a place of children and couples and grandparents, a place where the biggest concern is typically sunburn or a missed flight home, where the specific horror of a child taken in the night from a bed in an apartment feels as incompatible with the setting as anything could feel. That incompatibility is part of what has given the case its specific, sustained grip on the public imagination. It is not a case that happened in a setting that prepared people to expect danger. It happened in a setting designed to make people feel safe, a resort that is specifically marketed to families, in a country with a low crime rate and a strong tourist economy that depends on the perception of safety. The violation of that specific context was part of what made the case so immediately resonant, so immediately frightening, to the millions of parents across Europe who had taken or were planning to take similar holidays in similar resorts, and who recognized in the McCann situation a mirror of their own vulnerability, the terrifying recognition that the thing you feared could happen had happened to people who were doing exactly what you would do. Kate and Gerry McCann have been asked, repeatedly, across 20 years, how they live with the knowledge of what happened and what has not been resolved. Kate McCann's answers to this question, in the book she wrote and in the interviews she has given, are among the most honest accounts in the public record of what it means to be the parent of a missing child. She describes the specific quality of a grief that cannot fully grieve, because the loss is not confirmed in the way that death confirms a loss. She describes the specific quality of hope that is not simple optimism, but something more complicated, more earned, more aware of its own limits. She describes the years in terms that are honest about how they have been, not simply dreadful, not simply sustained by hope, but genuinely mixed, containing moments of normalcy and even happiness, alongside the central, constant reality of Madeleine's absence. The twins, Sean and Amélie, are the other constant in Kate and Gerry McCann's lives. They were born in February 2005, making them 2 years old when Madeleine disappeared. They are now adults, in their early 20s, and they have been raised by parents who made the decision very early that while they would never stop looking for Madeleine, they would also not allow the search to consume everything, that Sean and Amélie deserved to have a childhood and a family that was present for them, even as it was necessarily, inevitably, shaped by the absence of their sister. The specific challenge of raising children in the shadow of a disappeared sibling, of explaining to a 2-year-old, and then a 5-year-old, and then a 10-year-old, and then a 15-year-old, where their sister is and what happened, while the answer to that question remains unknown, is a challenge that Kate and Gerry McCann have had to manage within their own grief and with their own limited knowledge. The twins have spoken briefly and publicly on occasion, in ways that are consistent with people who were raised to be thoughtful about the case and about their own position within it, who understand the significance of what happened to their sister and who carry that understanding with a dignity that reflects the environment in which they were raised. They have said that they remember their sister, though the precision of their memory of a sibling they last lived with when they were 2 years old is necessarily limited. They have said that they hope for answers. They carry, in the specific way of siblings of missing children, an absence that is both private family grief and public knowledge, a gap in their family that the world is aware of and that they live inside. The Leicestershire town of Rothley, where the McCanns live, has been the location of numerous media vigils and campaigns over the years, the specific geography of the family home becoming associated in the public mind with the case, in the way that places associated with significant events become associated with those events. The community around the McCanns has, by all accounts, provided the kind of sustained, practical, thoughtful support that real communities provide to families experiencing sustained and public trauma, and that support has been part of the resource that has allowed the McCanns to keep going across 2 decades of uncertainty. The investigation's Portuguese dimension has had its own sustained story across the years. The Polícia Judiciária, after archiving the case in 2008, remained connected to the international investigation, providing cooperation to Operation Grange and participating in the broader effort to find answers. The relationship between the British and Portuguese investigations has been, at various points, tense, reflecting differences in approach and differences in conclusion about the evidence, but has also been, at other points, genuinely cooperative, with both forces contributing to an investigation whose complexity required the participation of both. The position of Gonzalo Amaral in the case's history deserves some consideration beyond his role as the original investigating detective. He became, after his departure from the case and the publication of his book, the most prominent advocate in the public sphere for the theory that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her parents were involved in concealing her death. His continued public advocacy for this theory, across the years of the McCanns' legal actions against him and beyond, has kept the theory in the public discourse in a way that has been painful for the McCanns, and that the subsequent developments in the investigation, particularly the emergence of Christian Brueckner as a suspect, have addressed without definitively answering. The specific question of whether the dog alerts and the forensic analysis that formed part of the original Portuguese investigation were indicators of what Amaral believed they were indicators of, or whether they were the result of contamination or misinterpretation or the specific limitations of the technology and the methodology involved, is one that has not been resolved by any subsequent judicial or investigative determination. The dog's behavior remains what it was. The laboratory results remain what they were. What those things mean remains, in the absence of a definitive account of what happened, uncertain. What the emergence of Christian Brueckner as a suspect does not do is definitively resolve this question, because the theory that Brueckner abducted Madeleine from the apartment and the theory that Madeleine died in the apartment before being removed are not necessarily the same theory, and the specific evidence that German prosecutors are working with and that British investigators are now analyzing could potentially be consistent with more than one account of how events unfolded. The investigators' stated belief, as expressed in the 2020 announcement, is that Madeleine is dead and that Brueckner is responsible. The specific mechanism by which those events are believed to have occurred has not been publicly detailed in a way that would allow the relationship between the current investigative focus and the earlier Portuguese investigation's findings to be fully assessed. This is the specific complexity of a case that has generated multiple theories, multiple lines of investigation, and multiple bodies of evidence, some of them pointing in similar directions, and some of them apparently contradictory, and that has not yet been resolved by the kind of formal legal proceedings that would require the evidence to be tested and the theory to be tested in a court. Until the case reaches a courtroom, the relationship between the different bodies of evidence and the different theories about what they indicate will remain a matter of analysis and debate rather than legal determination. The international dimensions of the case extend beyond the three-country investigation. In the years since 2007, Madeleine's photograph has circulated in countries across the world as part of missing child alerts, and reports of possible sightings have been received from dozens of countries. Each report has been assessed. Most have been quickly eliminated as cases of mistaken identity or unfounded claims. None has led to the finding of Madeleine or to the conclusive identification of the person responsible for her disappearance. The global reach of the case, which is unlike any other missing child case in history, in terms of the geographic spread of public awareness and the number of countries where her photograph is recognized, is both a reflection of the intensity of the campaign to find her and a measure of how completely the case has failed to produce the one outcome the campaign was designed to produce. The specific character of a case that has been this publicly prominent for this long and that has remained genuinely unresolved is one of the things that makes the McCann case a unique chapter in the history of missing persons investigations. Most cases of this scale resolve, one way or another, within a period of months or a few years. The fact that this one has remained unresolved for nearly 20 years, despite the resources committed and the public attention sustained, reflects both the specific difficulties of the investigation and the specific strength of the evidence that has prevented the straightforward application of the most obvious conclusions. The Portuguese investigation failed to build a sufficient case against any identified individual. The British investigation has identified a suspect who has not been charged. The German investigation has named a suspect who is now free. The legal architecture within which all of this is operating is itself part of the story. The specific provisions of European and international law that govern extradition, mutual legal assistance, and the sharing of evidence across jurisdictions determine what is possible and what timeline it can happen on. The specific requirements of English and German criminal law for the charging and prosecution of suspects determine what evidence must exist and in what form for proceedings to begin. The investigators know these requirements and are working toward meeting them. The timeline is not within their complete control, because the legal processes involved are not entirely within the control of investigators, and because the specific decisions of courts and legal authorities at multiple levels are required to advance the proceedings. Christian Brueckner's current status, under electronic monitoring and without a passport in Germany, represents a situation that is not stable in the long term. that requires either formal legal proceedings to justify its continuation or its eventual termination. The German authorities who have imposed the monitoring conditions have done so under German law, and the conditions can continue only as long as the legal basis for them exists and is renewed. If the investigation produces charges, the conditions would likely evolve to reflect whatever bail or remand status accompanied those charges. If the investigation does not produce charges within the relevant legal timeframe, the conditions would need to be revisited. The investigation is, in part, racing against this clock. The families of all the people connected to this case, not only the McCann family but also the children, whose abuse Brueckner was tried and acquitted for, and the American woman he was convicted of raping in Praia da Luz in 2005, have been living alongside this investigation and its implications across years or decades. Each of them carries a different relationship to the case, and a different relationship to the person who is its prime suspect, and the way the case finally resolves, or fails to resolve, will have different meanings for each of them. For the McCanns, the resolution that matters, the one that would mean something, is specific, an answer about what happened to their daughter, and accountability for whoever is responsible. Kate McCann has said that she wants to know the truth, regardless of what that truth is. Gary McCann has expressed similar sentiments. What they have asked for, consistently and across 20 years, is not vengeance or a particular outcome, but information, the specific information about their daughter's fate that would allow them to know what they have been not knowing for nearly 2 decades. That is a request that the investigation is working towards satisfying. The summer of 2026 represents, in the assessment of those following the case most closely, the most advanced state of that work since the investigation began. What the following months and years produce, whether a trial and a verdict and the specific, final accounting that those things would represent, is not yet known. But the work continues. The case is open. The answer, somewhere, exists. Madeleine McCann was 3 years old. She disappeared from a bedroom in an apartment in Portugal on the night of May 3, 2007. She would be 22 years old in 2026. She has not been found. The investigation has not stopped. The world has not stopped looking for the truth of what happened to her. And somewhere, in the specific convergence of the evidence assembled and the legal processes being pursued, and the investigators working across 3 countries with a body of material that represents nearly 2 decades of cumulative investigative effort, that truth exists, and the people responsible for bringing it into the open have not yet given up. Neither has her family. Neither should the world. The Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, the specific place where Madeleine McCann was last confirmed to be safe and alive, has continued to operate in the years since 2007. Holiday families continue to stay there. The apartment block where the McCanns stayed, Block 5, still stands. The tapas restaurant is still there. The pool, the tennis courts, the same mild Algarve climate that drew the family to Portugal in the first place, all of it continues to exist, in the way that places continue to exist after the events that define their public identity have occurred, carrying the dual character of being both what they are and what happened there. This continuation is not uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Algarve is safe. Praia da Luz is safe. The vast majority of the millions of families who have taken holidays there in the years since 2007 have returned home with nothing more than sunburn and good memories, and the specific horror of what happened to Madeleine McCann is not a reason for families to avoid the Algarve or the Ocean Club or any other resort in Portugal. What it is a reason for, and what it became a reason for immediately in 2007 and has remained a reason for in the years since, is a careful consideration of the specific arrangements made for children during the specific vulnerability of holiday evenings, the conditions under which children are supervised, and where and by whom. This is not to say that the McCanns did anything wrong on the evening of May 3, 2007. The question of parental responsibility in the case of Madeleine's disappearance is one that has been the subject of considerable public discussion and some very unkind public commentary, and it is a question that the investigation, in its official capacity, has addressed. The Portuguese police investigation, during the period when the McCanns were given arguido status, examined their conduct on that evening as part of a broader examination of the circumstances of Madeleine's disappearance. Operation Grange, the British investigation, has not focused on the McCanns' conduct on the evening. The German investigation has explicitly named someone else as the responsible party. The conduct of parents who leave young children sleeping in holiday apartments while dining at a nearby restaurant within a resort is not uncommon. It is something that families across Europe do, have done, and will continue to do, with the specific calculation that the proximity is sufficient, that the checks are frequent enough, that the setting is safe enough. Most of the time, those calculations are correct. On May 3, 2007, in Praia da Luz, something occurred that made the specific calculation made by the McCanns and their friends on that evening catastrophically wrong. Whatever that something was, it is the subject of the investigation that has been running for 19 years. It is not a failure of parental care in the ordinary sense, and to treat it as such is to misunderstand both the case and the situation of the McCanns, who have lived with the specific guilt of the particular circumstances of their daughter's disappearance in ways that they have been honest about, without the public's additional condemnation being appropriate or helpful. The public discussion of parental responsibility in the McCann case is an example of a broader phenomenon that has emerged in the social media era, the phenomenon of mass public judgment of the conduct of individuals in circumstances of tragedy that the public has not experienced and does not fully understand. The McCanns were, from the very beginning, subject to a level of public scrutiny and public comment about their conduct that was simultaneously a function of their case's unique public prominence and a distressing experience for people who were already living through the worst thing that had happened to them. The social media environment in which the case has existed since its second decade has amplified this phenomenon significantly. Kate and Jerry McCann have, as noted, taken legal action against those who have published the most seriously unfounded allegations about them. They have also, in their public statements and their advocacy work, attempted to redirect public attention from the question of their conduct to the question of what happened to their daughter, which is both the morally appropriate focus and the investigatively relevant one. This redirection is an ongoing effort, because the public appetite for narratives that place the most comprehensible, most accessible figure, which in many accounts of the case is the parents, at the center of a causal explanation, is persistent and requires persistent counter-narrative from the people who understand the case most fully. The Find Madeleine campaign, the formal charitable fund established by the McCanns in the weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, has continued to operate across the years, receiving donations and spending them on activities related to the investigation and to the wider goal of improving outcomes for families of missing children. The fund has been the subject of transparency requirements and public scrutiny of its finances across the years, consistent with the scrutiny applied to any charitable organization, and has operated with the specific transparency that both legal requirement and public responsibility demand. The McCanns have been paid no salary from the fund. The money raised has gone to the investigation and to related activities. The relationship between the Find Madeleine campaign and the official investigations has evolved across the years, from a period when the campaign was largely funding independent investigative activity in the absence of official investigation, through a period of coexistence with Operation Grange, to the current period in which the primary investigative activity is being conducted by official agencies, and the campaign's role has evolved to reflect that. The campaign continues to maintain a public presence and to receive contributions, and it continues to be the vehicle through which the family communicates publicly about the case and its developments. The specific legal framework within which any potential prosecution of Christian Brueckner in connection with Madeleine's disappearance would occur has implications for the role the family would play in any trial. In English criminal proceedings, the families of victims are entitled to make victim personal statements that are read to the court at the point of sentencing if a conviction is achieved. In German criminal proceedings, the role of the family is different, shaped by the specific provisions of German criminal procedure. In Portuguese proceedings, different again. Whatever jurisdiction ultimately processes the case will determine what role Kate and Jerry McCann, and whatever other family members choose to participate, are able to play in the formal legal proceedings. Kate and Jerry McCann have said repeatedly that they want to be present for whatever proceedings occur, that they are committed to the process and to the outcome, that they want to understand what happened to their daughter in the fullest and most complete way possible. This commitment has been maintained across 19 years, during which the process has been enormously demanding of them, and there is no indication that it will diminish in whatever period remains before the case reaches the point at which those proceedings either occur or are definitively concluded to be impossible. The possibility that the case does not reach a courtroom, that Christian Brueckner is never charged in connection with Madeleine's disappearance, that the evidence assembled is not ultimately sufficient to support the charges that would lead to a trial, is a possibility that the investigating authorities have not explicitly acknowledged, but that is inherent in the nature of criminal investigation. Not every investigation produces a prosecution. Not every prosecution produces a conviction. The investigators are working toward a prosecution, and the German prosecutors have stated their confidence in their conclusion about Brueckner's responsibility, but the gap between a prosecutor's confidence and the evidentiary standard required for a conviction is real, and it is the gap that the current phase of the investigation is working to close. Madeleine McCann would be 22 years old in the summer of 2026. The child in the posters and the press releases and the news reports, the 3-year-old with the blonde hair and the distinctive mark on her right eye, is the only version of Madeleine that most of the world has ever known. The version of Madeleine that Kate and Jerry McCann carry with them, the memory of the specific child they knew, the things she said, and the things she liked, and the way she laughed, and the way she behaved when she was tired or when she was happy. That version is private and specific and belongs to the people who loved her, the parents and siblings and wider family who knew her in the way that only the people who live with a child know them. The public version, the image that has been circulated for nearly 20 years, is what the world has to work with, and the world has held that image with a persistence that is, in part, a measure of how much the case has mattered to people beyond the family. The image of a 3-year-old child who vanished from a holiday apartment without trace is an image that produces, in most people, an immediate and sustained emotional response, a recognition of vulnerability and loss that does not require knowing the child personally to feel. That response has driven the public engagement with the case across 2 decades, and the engagement itself has been part of what has kept the official investigations funded and resourced. The case has become, over nearly 20 years, part of the cultural memory of a generation, part of the specific landscape of events that people of a certain age in Britain and across Europe carry with them as reference points, as moments that defined what a particular period felt like. May 2007, Praia da Luz, the McCann family, BTK. These things are in the cultural memory, in the specific way that events of great emotional resonance become part of the cultural memory, not as historical fact exactly, but as felt reality, as something that happened in the world and that left a mark on how people understood the world. What the case will eventually mean once it is resolved in whatever way it is resolved is something that cannot be determined before the resolution. If Christian Brueckner is tried and convicted in connection with Madeleine's disappearance, the case will mean one thing, will be a story with an answer, a case that took nearly 2 decades, but that ultimately produced the specific accountability that 20 years of investigation were working toward. If the case is never resolved, if no trial ever occurs and no verdict is ever delivered, it will mean something else, will be a different kind of mark on the culture, the largest unresolved missing child case in modern European history, a warning about the limits of what investigation can establish and what legal systems can prove. The investigators working on it in the summer of 2026 believe they are working toward the first of those 2 possible endings. The evidence dossier, the extradition proceedings, the cooperative relationship between British and German law enforcement, the electronic monitoring of the prime suspect, all of these are consistent with investigations that are building toward a specific legal conclusion rather than winding down in the absence of one. Whether they are right, whether the case will reach a courtroom, and whether the courtroom will produce a verdict, and whether the verdict will be what the investigators believe the evidence supports, is not yet known. It cannot be known in advance of the proceedings themselves. What can be said is that the case is active, that the investigation is in progress, and that the people working it have not concluded that it is beyond reach. Madeleine McCann was 3 years old. She was on a family holiday in Portugal. She disappeared in the night. She has not been found. She would be 22 years old. Her family has not stopped searching for the truth of what happened to her. The investigation has not stopped. The world owes her an answer. The world has not yet given it, but the world has not stopped trying.